for being honest, like what threads all that together is recruiting operations, continuously improving our processes given the current state and just maximizing what we have in place. So yeah, for me, hiring excellence is making sure that it's really at the core of recruiting operations is doing a little bit more with less, right?
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm Shannon Ogborn, your host, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO. I am here today with our amazing guest, Max Butler, Head of Talent Operations at CaptivateIQ. Not only does Max have a long tenure in recruiting operations where he scaled up several RecOps teams and practices at companies like Bain and Lime, but he was a recruiter in his former life earlier in his career. Max, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
So let's give the audience a little bit of background on yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about CaptivateIQ and your current role there?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I have been in recruiting my entire career and have worked with some large and small companies. And last year, I joined CaptivateIQ to lead their talent operations function. And CaptivateIQ, if you haven't heard of them, is a leader in the commission solutions space. And my role here is to help the team operate as effectively and efficiently as possible.
Amazing. And I know that you moved into an ops role full-time in about 2016. Do you consider yourself kind of like a RecOps OG?
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself, but it's funny because in 2016, yeah, it was a very uncharted territory. There wasn't a lot of recruiting operations professionals in the space. And even to today, I'm getting a lot of questions like, what is recruiting operations? So what, you hire operations people? And so I guess if you step back and really look at the recruiting operations history, maybe, but I wouldn't consider myself, there's a lot of better and smarter recruiting ops people in the space that I've learned a lot from. But yeah, when I stepped in, I told my company at that time that I wanted to focus on recruiting processes, fix our tools and systems, make sure everything's integrated, and spin off different recruiting programs and not run recruiter phone screens and schedule interviews. It was kind of a, what? Is that a function? Is that a thing? But luckily, a couple of people are incredibly supportive of me during that time to do it. And so, yeah, I stepped into a recruiting operations role full time around 2016. And learned from a lot of really brilliant people in this very small community and have grown with it ever since.
That's amazing. For what it's worth, I consider anyone who entered RecOps in 2016 OG.
Okay, well then I'll take it.
Okay. Well, I would love to hear more about what you feel like is a big challenge you've seen come up in the TA space in your time working in RecOps.
Yeah, so the last couple of years, it's been a really interesting time to be in recruiting operations and solely focus on overall efficiency across recruiting or talent acquisition organizations, because there's been this explosion of recruiting tools, recruiting products, and the overall talent or recruiting landscape has grown significantly in the last few years, which, like I said, it can be a great thing, but also it causes a lot of noise and a lot of chaos. And recruiters tend to go after the new shiny object, and they want to, implement something new, something that can help them save some time or make them a little bit more efficient throughout their day to day. But I think that the biggest challenge or the most interesting has been just in the last few years here of navigating through this economic uncertainty and what that means for recruiting. And so for recruiting operations, it's how do we implement the right tools and systems to keep the team on track? And how do we make sure that not only the business is aligned with what the recruiting team is able to do, but what does the hiring plan look like in the next few years? And what does the recruiting team do during a downturn? And so that, I think, in the last 3 to 4 years has probably been the biggest challenge for recruiting operations in my perspective, is that we're not just recruiting and recruiting and recruiting. We're starting to shift a little bit more to quality over quantity. And that's been the biggest challenge of like, how do we make sure that we're being way more efficient with our time and with our approach to recruiting in general? And when we're not spending 90% of our time screening candidates, reviewing applications, and doing what recruiters, sourcers, and coordinators are doing majority of the time, like what are some of the projects and tasks and things that can help add value to the business, but also keep them locked in and motivated? So I think in the last 3 to 4 years, for my time in RecOps, has been one of the most interesting and challenging just navigating this economic uncertainty.
For sure. And I know we've talked about this before, but RecOps seems to, and I know a lot of RecOps folks have been impacted by layoffs and things like this, but there's also a lot of companies who don't have RecOps people. Do you feel like companies are hiring RecOps appropriately, or what do you think is happening in the space there?
No, I don't think that they're hiring RecOps appropriately. And fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, I had a kind of a front row seat to this a few years ago, maybe a year ago, but I decided that I wanted to interview for a couple different companies and just to learn for my own good what recruiting operation roles were out there and what exactly people were looking for. And there's two things that I learned out of that is that companies wanted to hire RecOps because it seemed like everyone else was doing it and it seemed like the attractive thing to do, and it could help them save some time and be more efficient and just have a single point person to take care of all of the things that were going wrong, which isn't terrible, and it's very common, and that's fine for most RecOps people to come in and step in and say, here's what we need to do and here's what's not working. But the second thing is that there was a lot of companies that had throughout many years or whatever it had been, had implemented new tools, had broken processes, had programs that were running but not being fully efficient. And so it seemed like sometimes that the whole place was burning down, and they're looking for a recruiting operations manager, a recruiting operations leader to come in and put out these fires and to build a team that could dedicate some of their time to focus on these tools, these systems, these processes, these different recruiting programs, figure out how we can run reporting. And so I think that has been the view for recruiting operations, like bring someone in to put out the fire or just bring someone in because everyone else is doing it. So I think that there needs to be a very clear definition as to what recruiting operations is and what value it brings to the business, and do that earlier before you build up a large organization, a massive recruiting team, start running processes, adding different tools and systems because someone else said they wanted to, but bring in recruiting operations to bring it all together and have more of a future outlook for the business and make sure that we're operating under that capacity and building for scale and not just coming in to fix what we had broken.
For sure. So it sounds like in terms of recommendation on the when, it's if you're bringing someone in because everything is broken, then you maybe should have considered it sooner.
Exactly. Yeah. It's funny because like it's never a problem until someone asks a question. And especially in recruiting, it's like when an executive lifts up the hood and is saying, why are we spending this much money on this? And how many hires does this produce us? What is the quality of this? Like when the questions start coming is when often organizations are saying, maybe we should have a person or persons in place to take care of this. So yeah, I think that it's really important to look at your company and your company growth holistically and probably have a recruiting operations professional come in early and grow with the company versus waiting till like 5-10 years down the road.
For sure. Now, obviously, if a company is early and things are breaking and they don't have this person, who should be the expected person to make this ask or advocate, and what should they really be saying?
Yeah, look at your recruiting leaders. And so if you don't have a dedicated ops person or people in place, then you look at your recruiting leaders, and oftentimes you'll see a lot of recruiting coordinators start to evolve or merge into more of an operations capacity, given bandwidth and what's going on and what are the priorities of the business. But what I've said is that if you look at your head of recruiting, your director of recruiting, you look at the different recruiting leaders and you want them to simply focus on different large scale projects or even some of the small tasks that start to build up, then you're starting to jeopardize the people management side of the business, and you're starting to jeopardize the overall objective and the goals for the recruiting team, because the recruiting leaders are bogged down with projects and tasks and different operations, administrative type work. And then that's where you sub in recruiting coordination. And I think that if you start having recruiting coordinators and sourcers that maybe have a little bit more bandwidth or can take on an extra 10% or take on things outside of their day-to-day, then you start to jeopardize candidate experience. You start to jeopardize outbound attraction. And so I think that is oftentimes where businesses look at recruiting leaders to figure it out, and then they delegate tasks and hand it off to other people on the team that have the bandwidth. But as we all know in recruiting, you could have a down point. You could have an average of 8 jobs on your plate, but that can change next week. And so It's a very volatile environment to where you can't just start to delegate large tasks, and you can't hand off something as large as a university or an internship program from recruiter to coordinator to sourcer to recruiter, given their ability to fill the jobs or whatever they're working on. So it's more important to have a point person to stick with that program from the beginning to the end. So yeah, I think that's where majority of companies and organizations are looking at the recruiting leaders to take care of this. But you're also in the role of like managing people and upskilling them and giving them a career path and making them the best version of themselves as they can be. So you need a recruiting operations person in place to take care of that.
For sure. If you were to give advice to a talent leadership person on discussing with their direct manager or even the CEO or executive leadership on why to hire a RecOps person early, what would you say to them, or how would you advise them on communicating the pros of having, like one point person for these responsibilities?
Yeah, I come back to operational efficiency, and what I've said is that my job here is to take away the noise and to declutter a lot of the moving pieces so recruiters can focus on doing their best work and sourcers can focus on doing their best work, and recruiting coordinators is that they don't have to get bogged down or distracted by all the things that should or need to get done. But if you want to have an efficient organization where everyone's doing their part and being the best that they can be in their function and their role, then you need to have someone within recruiting operations or someone that sits behind the scenes to make sure you're enabling them to do their best work. And so that's where I think the biggest selling point is like, if you want a recruiter to make sure you're creating great experience and managing their candidates, and sourcers attracting the best talent on the market for your organization, and coordinators also creating an amazing experience and keeping the wheels spinning, then you're going to have a need for recruiting operations. And then also, more importantly, when you have those questions of how are we performing? How can I find this information? Are we getting the most out of these certain products that we've invested heavily on? Then you have a point person, you have a group that you can go to get those answers.
For sure. And I feel like there's a big difference between people being interested in recruiting operations responsibilities and wanting to take those on and being curious and trying to move in that direction versus thrusting them upon your team because there's no one else to do them. I think that is just a slippery slope to people being ineffective at that task because they're not interested, and it's not like, oh, it's all so easy to do. Like, there's people who specialize in these areas, and it's really great to have someone like that who can take the burden and the load off the recruiting team so that, like you said, they can do their best work and have the best output and the best outcomes, which really benefits the company, of course.
Yeah, of course. It's really easy to get distracted by wanting to figure out what the historic pass-through rate is for my job or for my hiring manager or for a department. And it's also really easy to just go down this path of finding, so-and-so used this sourcing tool that has been game changer for them and I want to buy it. And so it's like trying to declutter or trying to cancel out some of the noise so people can focus on the task at hand. But also at the same time, like, it's most important for recruiting operations to bring people together and to hear their voices and to hear their pain points and to hear what's going on. So we are being thoughtful as to what changes we're making through the processes or what tools we're adding or what we're removing.
For sure, because if you talk to, let's just say, a coordinator, a recruiter, and a hiring manager on an individual job search that for a rec that you have open, the experience of the pain points is going to be significantly different for all of those people and all of the functions that and capacities that they work in. And having a person who can collect the information and objectively say, okay, after hearing from everybody, here's what's not working, and we can change the process and iterate so that we can get this process working for everybody, because everybody needs to be bought into the process for it to really be operating at high efficiency.
100%. Yeah.
I would love to hear some more about some of the challenges maybe that you've faced implementing processes that are more like size appropriate, but also prime for scaling. I feel like within RecOps, you want to create efficiencies with where you're currently at, but part of the challenge is you really want to be able to accelerate those processes in the future for scale. Do you have any thoughts or examples on how that's played out for you?
Yeah. I do. And I'll think back to early in my career, I'd say my recruiting operations career, where I will admit I was very short-sighted on a lot of the problems at hand and implementing things that were quick fixes. And I think that really going to Lime, to say, is that where there was a larger volume and people around the globe and a lot more moving pieces, that we had to think more at scale. And that was a big learning lesson for me, is that you can't think of the here and the now, but you want to make sure that you're implementing something that aligns with the business growth. And so that comes a lot back to having recruiting operations and recruiting leaders in touch and in tune with the business plan and with the objectives of the business, and not just in that year or in that 6 months, but what does the next 3 to 5 years look like for us? And so then that completely changes a recruiting operations professional's approach to implementing something new or adjusting a process. You want to make sure that's scalable. You want to make sure that it fits the business for where they'll be in 3 years. And so I learned a lot in just the last few years on exactly that, but not being short-sighted on the changes that you make. And even though it might solve a pain point for a recruiter today, you want to make sure that it's going to fit the business growth in the next couple of years. And then the flip side of that, it's really explaining the why to the recruiting team as to why we're doing this, because there's a huge disconnect between what the recruiters are working on and what the recruiting coordinators and the sourcers are working on, but also where the business is going and why we may be making changes to the offer letter process, or why we may be making changes to the overall interview process, and something that can support global growth or something that could support higher quality. There's a number of different reasons why, but I've found that if you can open up the doors and share some of the transparency as to what the business is and making sure that recruiting's aligned and sharing the why with the recruiters, it makes it significantly better. But you definitely don't want to be caught as a recruiting operations professional making a change just to solve for a short-term problem without thinking a couple of years or, a few feet down the road.
For sure. And if we're being real, people, there's this concept, right? Or you see it on people's resume, thrives in change, loves change. Humans innately, don't love change. So when you start changing all these things to the process, people are like, oh my gosh, there's so much resistance at the leadership level all the way down to your recruiting team. I would love to hear, and this, this question is actually kind of more for the RecOps folks who may be listening. What advice would you have to give to RecOps folks trying to work with the recruiting team to make changes? What have you seen to be some effective tactics of communicating things and, going through a proper change management process so people are actually on board with what you're changing?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up, because there's nothing more frustrating and or confusing of just plopping in a recruiting operations person or a team of recruiting operations professionals that's going to tell recruiters and sourcers and recruiting coordinators that maybe had been there for a while what we're going to do differently. And so understanding again, explaining the why, but I think that my advice to anyone in recruiting operations and what has benefited me tremendously is shadowing and just learning and watching. And so for the last couple of roles I've been in, my first step is to sit down and watch how a recruiter navigates through the ATS. I want to listen to recruiter phone screens. I want to see how a recruiting coordinator schedules. And I want to see how a sourcer puts together sequences or reaches out to top talent. And from there, I gather my notes and gather my approach and to learn from the business as to why I'm here and what direction we're going to. But there's nothing more damaging or something that could really tarnish your reputation by stepping into an organization and say, this worked well here, so therefore we're going to now have 2 interviews at this point. You want to make sure you learn and fully absorb how the team's operating today and watch them as you see them hit bottlenecks. And when they give you that answer and you say, well, why do you do it that way? And they say, that's just the way I was taught. Like, those are things you want to take notes of and record and say, okay, well, we're going to do this because it's going to make your life easier based off of this. And we're going to let you know what this person's doing and this person, so we can have a uniformed approach on how we move candidates through the process or how we schedule interviews. So yeah, I think that is the most important thing for recruiting operations professionals, whether you're in a role today that you've been in for many years, or if you're stepping into a new organization, is just learn how the recruiting team functions across the board, and then take your information and come up with an approach. But yeah, I think that's the most important.
Yeah, I love what you said about shadowing, and even to take it a step further, this is my recruiting hot take, and one of my recruiting hot takes, I have so many, we'll get to yours in a little bit, but one of my personal recruiting hot takes is that and I think you could apply to this to RecOps too, every person in talent leadership should be required to work with multiple candidates from A to Z a year so that they can get a sense of what is the scheduling experience for our coordinators, what is the experience for our sourcers outreaching to people, do we have good messaging, do we have things buttoned up, do we have good tools for them to be able to do their job well, how is the candidate experience, how hard is it to make a candidate's experience great at the company that we're at. I think it should be a requirement for all talent leaders, because it's just like, you can empathize, right? And you can hear people, but it's so much better when you just like know from doing that you're like, wow, that was painful to schedule. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing better or more eye-opening than just observing. And it's like, well, why are they doing it like this? And oftentimes it's like they just simply don't know, or that was how they taught, or that's a practice that they carried over from a previous place. And sometimes it's awesome. And sometimes it's like,
right.
Wait, have you told people about this? Like, so it's just gathering the data, it's knowledge sharing, and then kind of mapping out your approach or your game plan.
Totally. I would love to hear more about, just kind of circling back to the argument of hiring a RecOps person early. What is the argument for the side of really like reducing recruiting debt and future cost?
I think it was more of an argument a couple of years ago. And now I don't even see it as an argument, because it's where companies, and just again, I mentioned earlier about economic uncertainty and the roller coaster the economy has gone through in the last couple of years. But now I see so many companies that are left with a recruiting team that used to be this big, but now it's this big. However, they have a whole bunch of debt. They have a bunch of different tools and systems that aren't being utilized, or maybe they are. No one really knows. But what we do know is that they're spending a whole bunch of money, or previously had spent a bunch of money on different things to make them more efficient or to help them do their jobs better. And so the argument, like I said, it's not much of an argument today, is that having a recruiting operations person come in and speaking to all the founders and executives and people that are building out recruiting teams today, is that you want to understand exactly where your dollars are going and what is the return. So maximizing ROI is one of my biggest focuses, and so should be for every recruiting operations professional and teams around the world. But having a very clear understanding of what tools and systems are producing for you and what else is out there on the market to either cost or to cut cost and produce the same results, or to double down and get the team bought in on the best tips, tricks, and practices to maximize that tool all the way up and through renewal or whatever it may be. So yeah, I think it was more of an argument in years prior of, this companies may have viewed it as a nice to have, but I don't see it as a nice to have anymore. That if you want to make sure that you have a cost-effective hiring process and you want to have a well-oiled hiring machine, which is oftentimes companies' biggest objective or one of their core objectives of to hire X amount of people or to hire people for this function, then you want to make sure you're doing it right from the get-go and not have to bring someone in 5 years and say, where have we gone wrong and what should we change? And so I think it is incredibly important for anyone that's gotten funding or any executives or anyone that is sitting in this position thinking, I need to hire, but we have X amount of time and limited resources and X amount of dollars, then recruiting operations is often the answer to give you a more strategic approach to hiring efficiency than just adding 7 recruiters or, adding a bunch of recruiters.
Kind of on the point of ROI, have you found it helpful at all to talk to business leaders in terms that are used other places in the business? Because I feel like there is a pretty big disconnect of recruiting language, and business leaders aren't always super comfortable with knowing the recruiting space. And business leaders oftentimes have a very good concept of, what's going on in marketing, what's going on in finance, what's going on in product and engineering, especially if the founders are product or engineering folks. But I feel like the same is not true for recruiting. Like, in terms of language you use with business leaders, do you try to adapt that language to more of a high level business sense?
Yes. Yeah. Just like all the other functions or departments you mentioned, recruiting should be no different. And that's the way I viewed my role is to open up the doors and to push transparency, not just across the recruiting teams, but across all businesses, is up to the executives and everyone that wants to know. It shouldn't be hidden to know exactly what our cost per hire is. It shouldn't be hidden to know what we're spending per month. It shouldn't be hidden what our offer acceptance rate is, our hires, our interview completion. Like, you want to share the good, the bad, and the ugly for all the appropriate stakeholders. And so you're exactly right when it's like the executives have a very strong pulse on what's happening across marketing or engineering, product design, whatever it might be. Why should it be any different for recruiting? And why should that information not be as accessible as it is for other functions? And so that is, I want to make sure that anyone in our business at the appropriate level has questions about how we're operating or what we're spending or what the return on the different investments that we've made and some of the success stories and some of the losses. It shouldn't be hidden. And that is part of recruiting operations and partnership with leadership is to share that information. Yeah. So sharing the return on investment and sharing that, yes, we spent X amount of money on this product. And not only the hires that we made, but like the quality of talent. This is the people that have interviewed coming through this channel, just sharing that information. But also, again, like recruiting leaders and recruiting, like having that data and information across the board and sharing like what they personally have felt and taking that to the table or taking that to the executives and taking that to different leaders and saying like, this has been incredibly helpful for us of like understanding what the pass-through rates are through different various channels and that we're spending this much less money, but we're maximizing this. Like that should all be shared information or at least accessible information at the very least.
For sure. And one thing that you've brought up a couple times is different technologies. And I know through our conversations, like one of the things that's important to you and probably to all RecOps folks, obviously, is keeping up with the technology. What means do you use to keep up with technology? Because it's just an evolving process, especially with AI being kind of thrown into the game here. We're just like tools everywhere. How do you evaluate technology? How do you keep up with what's out there?
Yeah. First, I have to say that I'm a huge nerd when it comes to recruiting technologies. I think that's really what pushed me into a full-time recruiting operations and dedicated my career to recruiting operations is because of the various tools and systems that you could implement or leverage to make your life easier. And so from there, I spend a very large portion of my weeks of just scouring like LinkedIn and reading different blog posts and watching a lot of YouTube videos and learning from a bunch of friends and former colleagues and a lot of connections in the space of what tools and systems that the team's using at the time, and how much they're spending on it and what they've gotten out of it. And so I think that just being naturally curious about the recruiting landscape and just doing your research. But I think that two things are most important. I've been with a couple different companies, wildly different in size. And so the pain points that you have at a 15,000 person company are very different than the pain points that you and your recruiting team is experiencing at a 300 person company. And so finding what is broken or what needs to be implemented for the stage or the size or the volume of recruiting you're doing is important to consider. And then, the other part to that is not just going after the loudest person in the room or the shiniest object, and making sure that you're adding to your tech stack that's going to give you the ammo to be incredibly successful. And so that's for me has been like, well, let's understand what's working and what's not and where we can flex. And then let's learn from people in the space and, let's not get too distracted with AI and ML and deep learning and whatever buzzwords they want to throw at you. But is this going to really solve some of our problems today and for the long haul? So I think that is the most important thing, is just being naturally curious and spending your time and your weeks and leveraging Slack communities or just within your own company and just getting a group of talent acquisition professionals together to talk about the recruiting landscape. And this is really interesting. This company's out to solve this problem, and starting to compare that to others. Like, I think that is incredibly beneficial, is to have a strong community around you and to learn like what companies are doing, because the last thing you want to do is, again, be short-sighted and say, everyone's buying this sourcing product, so will we. Well, sometimes that doesn't work. It works for them, but it doesn't work for you. And
right.
So doing your due diligence is incredibly important. But
I feel like it's the same with like plugging and playing. You alluded to this earlier with some other like process oriented stuff. It's like, oh, well, I used X at my previous company and it worked great. So I'm going to join this company and immediately implement all of these tools and softwares, poor change management, like no thought into what the process at the company looks like. Tools, there's so many tools out there, which I think is great. I think it's great to have a competitive landscape where it's pushing innovation, but it's not always a one size fits all. You could have one recruiting product that worked great at your previous company, but for reasons that are related to the company culture or the recruiting culture or the way the process is oriented, the tool is just not going to be successful. Like, it's surprising how many times people will bring in tools at a company just because they used it previously and they feel comfortable and confident with the tool. Yeah.
And that's unfortunately so many different people I've met with in the last year and so many companies I've seen have done exactly that, where they built up a large recruiting team, recruiters, coordinators, leaders had come in and saying, I used this before, it's amazing, we have to do it. Well, then unfortunately they have to let go of many people on the recruiting team, but then the business now has X amount of dollars going towards recruiting and they have very little hiring, and they're saying, what the hell just happened? And then they're like, maybe bring in an operations person to just review this and figure out how we can negotiate contracts or connect these things or cancel this or do that. And so it's like, it's really important to have someone in early to do things right and say, I hear you. I know it's a great product and we'll look into it and we'll do our due diligence. But so that, I think that's a really important for executives and leaders around the world to know, like, don't get caught to a point like you don't know what your hiring scale will look like, even though things are great today. You may not hire 500 people next year. You may not need all this. You may need to scale back. You need to focus on quality. And so, yeah, that's unfortunately a lot of businesses are in that position, like, whoa, we're pushing a lot of money out towards recruiting, but we're not recruiting.
I've definitely heard some recruiting leaders, not necessarily RecOps people, but they've said that, they had an ATS, they went into a new organization, they were like, I feel comfortable and confident with this ATS. And why wouldn't you want that product? Because it makes you look competent to know what the product is and know how to use it. But in the end, they've said they've regretted it because they did a bad job on change management, and that tool just ended up not fitting the needs of the organization. And then you're stuck kind of walking back what you know, and that's your reputation. So it's definitely an interesting problem to have there.
Yeah. Which again is good to have recruiting operations there to look around every corner, behind every door, and say, I've evaluated all the terrible and all the amazing scenarios. And regardless of what plays out, this is still going to be the right ATS for us or the right tool for us. So
yeah, it's like the tools is good for what? You know, like there's more
the here
to it
and the
than
now, or
there's more to it than it's just good. It worked for us in the past is more the underlying language there. But yeah, I would love to hear on the topic of hiring and kind of what hiring really well looks like. What does hiring excellence really mean to you?
Yeah, for me, the first thing at a very high level that comes out is when everyone knows their role and is doing their part. And so it's kind of a way of saying everyone's firing on all cylinders. And that's not just recruiting, but everyone that's a part of the process. And so I think that a very easy way of looking at it and putting it is that the team just knows their roles and things work is what hiring excellence looks like for me. But then like going a little bit further is, creating a streamlined and optimized hiring process with minimizing your resources as well as time, but still achieving some of the desired outcomes, right? So that means like eliminating some of the unnecessary steps and the bottlenecks and maximizing the effectiveness at each stage of the process. And kind of goes back to just like everyone just knowing what to do and doing their parts. But for me, that's where, whether it's headcount planning and forecasting to sourcing strategies and interview training, assessment, all the way through the experience is when you're doing all those things right, I could say that's where hiring excellence comes into play. And honestly, if we're being honest, like what threads all that together is recruiting operations, continuously improving our processes given the current state and just maximizing what we have in place. So yeah, for me, hiring excellence is making sure that it's really at the core of recruiting operations is doing a little bit more with less, right?
For sure. Before we get to your hot take, anything that we didn't cover today about RecOps or, kind of the persuasion of getting RecOps hired earlier in an organization, anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to add?
No, I would just again reiterate, like, don't wait until it's too late. And when, things start to catch fire and when things start to break and those gaps in your foundation start to widen, have recruiting operations in place that can think a few more feet down the road and see the issues and put things together and build things that align with the business needs. I think that's the biggest takeaway and just overall definition of recruiting operations. And, we could talk for days about it, but no, nothing specifically that we didn't get to that I want to go on too big of a tangent on.
Cool. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but when something rhymes, like don't wait until it's too late, people say like, it's true because it rhymes. But it is true. You really can't wait till it's too late, because then you've just accrued so much debt that you're going to be working yourself out of that hole for a bit. So definitely good advice there. Well, that takes us to our last question, my personal favorite segment of the podcast. What is your recruiting hot take?
Yeah, my hot take when it comes to recruiting is it can be summed up with don't sleep on the kickoff meeting. And again, talking about tangents, I found and I've learned over the years that when recruiters or anyone involved in a search or whatever their role is that when they oftentimes are hitting a wall and they're struggling and they have low conversion rates and nobody wants to advance that candidate to offer or no one's accepting their offer, that there's a step, one of the most important steps in a recruiting process that was missed, and it's the kickoff meeting with the hiring manager. And I've learned that not being well calibrated with your hiring manager and everyone that's involved with the search has a ripple effect with this job. And you may find yourself 60, 70, 80, 90 days down the road and not having any traction on a search. And there's nothing everyone that's listening is going to understand that bogs you down and frustrates you more than not having any success with a role and you feel like something's off. Well, again, oftentimes it's coming back to the kickoff meeting. And I think it's an incredibly valuable time for recruiters to flex and be a true talent advisor or a true talent partner to the business and say, bring some data to the table and let them know, hey, historically, this is how many interviews it took to make a hire. This is how long the job has been open for this team or department in years past. Here's what's expected of you, and here's what I can deliver, given that you are well calibrated on what we're looking for, why the position's open. But and a lot of people I've learned, recruiters have rolled their eyes because it's the same job. We're just opening it again. It's an evergreen role. I'm doing it again. But why not take 30 minutes, 45 minutes to jump on a Zoom call with your hiring manager and tell them about the market? Say, hey, yeah, we've seen more people apply. We've seen more people drop out. We've, just give them a pulse of what you see on a day-to-day basis that they are completely blind to. And also learn, how's the morale on the team? What exactly do you want out of this person? What's the first 3 months going to look like for this person? What's success look like? How could you not spend 30 to 60 minutes talking to a manager about this? And doing so will help you, and also make sure your sourcer, your coordinators, your HRBP, whoever else is involved in the search is part of that meeting. So you all have documented approach as to how you're going to tackle this search. What are the expectations from all parties? And let's check in on it. But that is one of, it irks me to hear people say, yeah, well, we have a kickoff meeting or more importantly, an intake meeting. I hate the word intake because it's not them delivering news to you and telling you what to do. It's to kick things off, and you are also setting expectations and setting some goals, setting the metrics, bringing data to the table. So it's not an intake. It's a two-way street. It's a true partnership. Have a kickoff meeting, spend some time with the hiring manager, make sure you're well aligned, you're calibrated on the role, and then start. So don't overlook the kickoff meeting. That's my take.
I love that take because you could spend 30 minutes up front and God forbid it's a waste of time. It's 30 minutes. Or you could waste 90 to 120 days of your life running in the wrong direction. And then you have to not only run back to your starting point, but then you have to run in another direction. So for sure, a really important part of the recruiting process. Absolutely. Amazing. Well, I think we are coming up on our time here. Where should people go to learn more about you and CaptivateIQ?
I'm on this website called LinkedIn. That is probably the best place to find me, reach out to me, hit me up. And you can also find CaptivateIQ on LinkedIn as well as CaptivateIQ.com. If you have a sales team or any commission-based roles, take a look at them. It's great. But yeah, LinkedIn's the place to go.
Amazing. Well, Max, I really appreciate you joining us on Offer Accepted today and spending time with us. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.